Today, a quick comparison between the Hanwei and the cold steel Hutton Saber. So starting at the blade, you'll see that the cold steel, as I move this back with the hilts together at the same point, the tangs I mean, you'll see that the cold steel is not inconsequentially longer, and it's more curved, so there's simply just more blade going on in the cold steel. However, a problem is that the Hanwei is incredibly stiff for a Hutton Saber, in my opinion. I spoke to Matt Easton, very gracious man. I really appreciate the fact that he took the time to answer my question. He agreed that this particular weapon is probably a civic sword from the early 20th century, styled off of a Saxon artillery saber, which in turn was styled off of a 1911 Blucher saber. That's neither here nor there. Point is, this is pretty obviously not really a cutting weapon. This is more of a stabby, and I find that this actually flexes more than the Hanwei does. So that should give you some indication of just how stiff this actually is. The Hanwei blade is, I would say, about twice the weight of the cold steel blade, and I find that makes it pretty disadvantageous in fencing, where it has a weight that's a lot, at least a perceived weight, much more like a military saber. In fact, I find that this bar of steel with an edge on it, the Spanish hanger from 1903, probably due to the fact that it has this brass hilt, is much livelier just to practice my fencing drills with than the Hanwei is. So the only thing, in my opinion, the Hanwei has going for it is that it can break guards more easily, but it's slower, and I don't feel comfortable thrusting people, especially without having a blunt at the tip, unless they're wearing real heavy equipment. But at that point, just fence with military sabers, huh? Now, what I'll say moving forward is that what the Hanwei does have going for it is the grip is simply larger than the cold steel grip, and what that means on every dimension. And what that means is that, well, you can fence barehanded with both of these, which you shouldn't, obviously. I mean, practice. But when you actually go to spar and you put anything other than rapier gloves, swordsman gloves, basically just leather gloves, and you put on like the lobster construction sort of gauntlets or heavier gloves, this becomes a problem. And I don't have particularly large hands. I wear a size large nitrile and mechanics gloves and a size medium driving gloves. So I don't have big hands, and this is still a problem. This is, in my opinion, objectively superior. I think the cold steel looks nicer, especially because it has actual wire. This has like a nylon thing, and the seam is here versus here on the cold steel, sort of out of sight, out of mind. But either way, I just think the Hanwei is better, because ultimately we buy these things to fence with them, not to look at them. This has not proven to be a problem once the thing is constructed, but I suppose it could be. Now, moving on to the guards themselves, some people think the cold steel guard is superior. I don't know what they're smoking. This is lighter, which kind of gives the whole sword a lighter feel because the blade isn't very heavy, but this did not take a lot. Now, to be fair to this was against a fetter, which is obviously anachronistic, but it's also a common thing to do in HEMA, so just bear that in mind. You're going to be hammering this a lot. The other sort of bad thing about this guard is this hole is way too big. That makes disassembly easy, but the problem is combine that big hole with these sharp, unrounded corners, and this will become very painful to practice barehanded with very rapidly, and this will rattle no matter what you do. It's actually why I have to put this ribbon in there, mostly to keep the corners out of my palm. But if rattle annoys you, bear that in mind. This one, it's much heavier. Like, this feels like twice the weight of that guard. I'm probably exaggerating, but that's what it feels like. And it's much tougher. This has taken just about as much punishment, and it has handled it like a champ. That smaller hole means that this does not rattle, but it also means disassembly is an absolute pain. I mean, I shouldn't exaggerate. It's harder. Neither of these are difficult swords to disassemble. But when you go to disassemble the cold steel, all you do is simply take an adjustable wrench or an appropriately sized box end wrench and unscrew this, and then simply pull on the back, and the whole thing slides apart. It's real easy. Because of the longer tang, and I don't even think that's entirely because of the grip length, the tang is simply longer on the Hanwei. It's as if it protrudes past the meeting point here, because you can see this little slot. This keeps everything together. So when you take the nut off, the tang is actually protruding out. So you cannot push it inwards to remove this. So you can't disassemble it from the back. You undo the nut, and then you have to beat this off the tang of the sword, which is a little bit of a headache. But either way, the cold steel is easier, but neither of them are particularly difficult to disassemble. Last thing, I find the tang on the cold steel to be nicer to look at. It's more precisely machined, I guess. It's narrower on this dimension, but it's wider on this dimension. Whereas the Hanwei, it's narrower on this dimension, thicker on this dimension. Which one matters more, I don't know. I do find that this is not particularly even. I would say this is the one that makes me nervous. And in addition to the stiffness and this tang, which I just don't like the construction of, my issue is that I find that oftentimes supposed carbon steel from China is actually a semi-stainless. Has to do with the, it's an economy of scale thing. But the problem is that stainless steels being chromium steels, I find that they're more prone to snap. This is one of the reasons stainless steel, you'll find that in pocket knives, not really in machetes, not good machetes anyway. And the point with this is that in my experience, when Indian-made steels, now this has a US on the tang, so allegedly it's US, but this is produced in India, I believe. I find that when the heat treat on Indian-made swords fails, they tend to take a set. But see, that gives you advance notice, because if it takes a set and then it takes a set in the other direction, you know you need to stop because you're work hardening a point like a paperclip. It can snap eventually. I find that with Chinese steels, when the heat treat fails, they snap, and if that happens on a lunge, you can, run someone through, which is not great. So in my opinion, there's no advantage to the Hanwei in actual fencing other than weight, which is really its main disadvantage, but you can break guards more easily. That's about it. I think that it doesn't hit harder on the cuts, but the thrusts it absolutely does. And I find that it's a little dangerous to fence with if you're not wearing like a fully padded jacket, which sort of defeats the purpose of a Hutton Saber for me and my intended use. I find it just to be a little sketchier to fence with. But I find that you will win more fights using this, and you'll be less concerned about hurting your friends severely. I think the guard and grip are better on the Hanwei. And I think disassembly is easier on the cold steel. So I put the cold steel as simply the objectively superior product. The one thing I could see as a justification for the Hanwei is if you basically want a military saber, but you can't afford it. And in which case I would say just save for the military saber. Because if you want, an Olympic fencing style saber, buy one. If you want a Hutton saber, I think this is, for at least my concept of a Hutton saber, which might be different than yours, for what I view the Hutton saber, it's niche. The cold steel fits the bill perfectly. I think the Hanwei is kind of a military saber and Hutton saber guys. And if you want a military saber or a Polish saber, buy a black fencer. I think that this will just not really serve your needs very well. Whereas I think the cold steel fits its niche very well. Well, happy fencing. Be safe.